Good day to everybody and welcome to the webinar on improving infrastructure regulations for countries affected by fragility, conflict and violence, and also low-income countries. My name is Jemima C. I'm a senior infrastructure specialist at the PPP group of the World Bank. Thank you for joining us. We have a number of participants already online, and we have a lot of participants who've registered for the course, so we're very excited to be with you all. We hope it's an interactive session. The webinar series is being organized with the help of the Open Learning Campus here at the World Bank and the Public-Private Infrastructure Advisory Facility within the PPP group of the bank, and also in partnership with the Public Utilities Research Center of the University of Florida. Now, what you will hear from our three discussants today is part of a broader initiative of these groups to build a body of knowledge on infrastructure regulation in fragile contexts, what works, what doesn't work, and how have other people overcome their challenges. Countries that are affected by fragility obviously are operating in an environment where it's very limited, where they have a number of significant political and operating challenges and constraints. And so today what we want to explore in the discussion and to have the participants engage with us on is really a couple of questions, so have a think about it. Does regulation play a role in infrastructure service delivery in fragile contexts, and how? And what resources are available to support stakeholders develop improved regulation systems in these challenging conditions? Also, please, just to let you know that this is being recorded. The links will be available after 24 hours. Secondly, there's a chat box. We welcome comments and questions or just interactions from the participants throughout the webinar. We'll be monitoring the screen. And finally, please also, if you're a multitasker, there is also a Twitter feed happening right at this moment. It's at PPIAF_PPP. So let me just go over how we're going to manage the webinar. What I'll do is I'll turn to a presenter. Our main presenter is Mark Jameson, and for 20 minutes he'll make a presentation, and really we'll get interventions from our two discussants, Dr. Roxana Carceres and also Yogita Mamsen, who's here in DC with me. Let me make a short introduction of our discussants already now, and then we'll move on to the webinar right away. So our main presenter is Mark Jameson. So he currently is the Director and Gunter Professor of the Public Utility Research Center at the Warrington College of the University of Florida. He is involved in a lot of international research and also professional training relating to regulation, including directing the PURC World Bank International Training Program on Utility Regulation and Strategy, which has trained over 3,000 regulatory professionals from over 150 countries. And many of them I see are also joining us at the webinar today. So hello to all the alumni of PURC. Our second discussant, Roxana Barantes Carceres. She is an economist and an associate professor at the Instituto de Estudios Peruanos. Roxana's professional experience is in applied microeconomics, but also works on privatization of infrastructure, regulation, and is interestingly working on issues of public policy and regulatory instruments for inclusive development. So we'll hear a little bit more about that and how you use these tools from Dr. Roxana. And then joining me here in DC, Yogita Mamsen is a senior infrastructure economist at the World Bank Water Practice. She's worked over 10 years on infrastructure service delivery, most particularly water and energy, and also focusing on sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. Yogita is an economist, also prior to the bank was in consulting, including the PricewaterhouseCoopers in London. So without much further delays, let me hand over to Mark, who is in Gainesville, Florida, who you see on your screen, for the main presentation.
Do a lot of work focusing on how do people understand infrastructure, how do we understand the regulation of infrastructure, and then this opportunity to focus on the fragile states is something we're very excited to be able to do. As I speak, and actually Roxana and I are in the same room, we're here teaching that 2-week course that you mentioned on utility regulation and strategy. And in fact, as we're teaching, we're using some of the tools that we're talking about for this particular webinar. And so I'll mention that as we go along the way. This particular work that we're talking about here is an extension of the body of knowledge on infrastructure regulation that we've been fortunate enough to be involved in for a number of years here at PERC, working with PPIAF and the World Bank. The body of knowledge is used hundreds of times every day by people all over the world who are trying to study, understand infrastructure regulation, the different strategies, how we design markets, how we think about pricing, how we design and practice regulatory institutions. So it covers those kinds of discussions, has numerous case studies, an annotated reading list of several hundred publications actually that we've identified that we think are world-class and things that people who are professionals in the field should be very familiar with. It also has a glossary, an extensive glossary translated now into 11 languages. In fact, if anyone visits that site and finds the glossary is not in their language, please contact us and we'll work with you to help get it translated into the language that you would be using. And then it also has a long list of frequently asked questions so that people can zero in on particular topics. The latest addition to that body of knowledge is this new portal that we've just been able to develop and launch on working in fragile states, trying to figure out how we can have a proper regulatory and governance system that ensures that that infrastructure development happens and serves the needs of that particular country, whatever those might be. This was done with support from PPIAF and the World Bank, and we had a lot of people involved in helping us with that. Roxana, indeed, was one of our technical advisors, people that looked at the work we were doing and gave us input and feedback on that to make sure we were using things correctly, understanding situations correctly, and zeroing in on the right topics. There are also strategic advisors who do high-level work around the world for fragile states. They gave us very valuable direction. And then in the courses we teach, we have had people review this content, give us their feedback, and use some of the tools so that we could be more effective in developing this information. So why did this matter? Well, as I think probably most of the people involved here know, when you have a fragile or conflict-affected state, the conflict has been devastating. According to the World Bank's numbers, almost 60 million people are displaced globally because of the situations in their countries, the breaking of peace, the conflicts that go on. And that peace is indeed fragile. Oftentimes those conflicts reoccur. And how we use infrastructure, how we make it available, and the way that is done affects the sustainability of that peace. Then, of course, when the conflict has happened, it has destroyed a lot of that infrastructure. Let me give you a couple of examples. Probably some of you on this webinar are familiar with this. For Burundi, for example, 12 years of conflict cut in half the number of electricity connections that had been there before the conflict occurred. Urban water access rates dropped 70% to 60% in that country. Cote d'Ivoire is another good example of this. Civil war, violent conflicts that occurred until 2011 had displaced over 700,000 people. And you can read the statistics. I don't need to. You can see how the water, sewage services were disrupted. The electric service was disrupted as well. And of course, in all the situations, the telecommunications is damaged, the roads are damaged, And so once a piece occurs, or is at least starting to occur, the question is, how can we rebuild that infrastructure? And that is the reason that we're focusing on the regulation, is because that regulatory commitment, what regulation does is it not only deals with whatever kind of market power there might be, and sometimes in these countries that's not the main issue, is the market power of the service providers. It also deals with the political power. If you talk with participants in our courses, and I understand other surveys confirm this as well, what people find most problematic in trying to get infrastructure developed and available to people is the political interference. So it's interesting that regulation, properly done, deals with both what you might have as problems with the service providers or industry, making sure they perform well, but also dealing with the political environment, making sure that there's an arm's length space between the investment decisions that are being made and the political decisions are being made, because those two worlds really aren't very compatible. They don't work very well at all. And you can see some of the statistics here. If you go to the portal for fragile states, you'll see a long literature of research that substantiates what I was just talking about. And then finally, why this matters is because there's actually a fairly narrow window of opportunity to make sure things are done well, and to make sure things are done in a scalable fashion, so that as we progress, as the country stabilizes and it advances, the things that we've done in getting the infrastructure in place very rapidly at the start are scalable into the future. So this is an image of what the new portal looks like. If you go to the Body of Knowledge website and click on the Fragile State, Fragile Conflict Affected State button at the top, this is the page that you will see. And it has 6 different kinds of resources that are available to you. And I want to describe what those are so that you're familiar with how to use them. But one thing I want to emphasize is that once a person is in that situation in the country, trying to put infrastructure back together, it's almost too late to refer to the portal. It'll be very useful, but the main thing one of the things I want to emphasize is that what we hope the portal is used for is for preparation, because we want the things that people do, people think about strategically in developing governance systems, regulatory systems for infrastructure, is that the impulses they have, that's about not the best term, the intuitions that they use that are second nature are things they will find from the lessons learned that we have here. So let me walk through each of these different areas of the portal. The first one talks about what are the key concepts. This is actually a narrative going through what are different forms of regulation that we could use, describing how well we could just start with contracts, or we could have licenses. We might, as things advance, develop laws, and maybe we're actually in a position where we can do that. In some instances, self-regulation might be appropriate, or subnational as opposed to national regulation might be appropriate. So this part of the portal explains each of those when they might be useful. It then also describes, as one of the things it provides, an overarching strategy. How do you deploy yourself? How do you develop the right kinds of momentum, coalitions to be able to work with? It emphasizes, for example, that you want a guiding, stable coalition that helps throughout this process, that helps people understand the sense of urgency of getting this done when the window of opportunity is open, of developing and articulating a clear vision of what's trying to be accomplished, what that future looks like, and what the dissatisfaction is with today, developing a strategy for the steps that we're going to follow, and then over-communicating, communicating constantly about what it is that the steps that are being taken, how we're doing things. And then after talking about that, those kinds of people issues, then this execution and strategy section goes into some of the processes. Be sure that we're making sure that we're empowering people to make decisions so that it's not so complicated that people can't operate strategically and take advantage of opportunities when they arise, and making sure we get early wins. because people need to see that progress. Sometimes, as we've looked at fragile states, and while sometimes the piece may start collapsing, it's because some of the promises that have been made haven't been kept. So getting those early wins so that things can be sustained. The next part of this portal is what we call a self-assessment tool. The self-assessment tool can be used for two purposes. One, it can be used for looking at the situation and trying to understand what countries are similar to my country, the country that you might be working in. So it'll be looking at what's the economy like, what's the political situation like, what is the culture like, the social cohesion, what is the governance like, security, and the current state of infrastructure. In the next part of the portal, I'll explain how this helps you compare to others. But this is, I think, a very useful tool, not just for getting a snapshot of where you are, but also being able to stimulate discussions. In fact, during the 2-week course that we're teaching right now, on the very first day, we had all of our participants take do this self-assessment tool for their countries, and then we put them in small groups so people could see where they agreed and disagreed, because it's an interesting thing that two people from the same country and even in the same sector will have different assessments of what's the economy like, what's the governance like, what is the infrastructure actually like. And so this becomes a very good tool for having those kinds of discussions so that people are focused on the most important issues and are working on the same purpose instead of cross purposes. So there are lots of different ways that you might be able to use this self-assessment tool. And then it also, let me just explain what some of the questions are like. So one of the questions that you'll have in that self-assessment tool are things like, for the economics, what are the income levels like of the country? So it says, can people afford the services? And a person chooses, well, almost never, seldom, almost always. You can look at access to the water infrastructure. What is that typically like in the country? And then after a person has gone through, or even as a group has gone through and answered all of those questions, then they get a map of how they are doing, at least according to that self-assessment. Are they getting a score of just 4 or 5? Are they scoring as high as 10 or 20? In their economic environment, the political environment, well, you can see all the categories around there. So that gives them some basis for discussion, some basis for thinking carefully about their situation, and then, as I was saying earlier, a basis for comparing themselves for other countries to see, well, who am I like? And so where can I look for lessons and examples? And that gets us to this third part of the portal, and that's country taxonomies. So we look across different types of countries, from those who are in a crisis stage clear up to those who are in a very resilient stage. And we give characteristics and descriptions of what those countries are like. And then there's a lot of case studies. So if you are working in telecommunications or you're working in water, and you find that, well, I'm in a transitioning category or I'm in a crisis category, you can find case studies of how people have coped with those situations. And not just the things that have gone great or well, but also the mistakes that have been made. Because sometimes we find that dealing with the mistakes is perhaps even more powerful and more informative than just seeing people's successes. So we have people from all the, case studies from all those situations that you see down at the bottom of the slide, from crisis to kind of rebuilding or reforming or recovering from a failure, transitioning, transformation, which is they're going into a maturing stage, or resilience, a very high-performing economy and situation. The fourth part of the portal is an annotated reading list, where we've gone through actually a long list of resources. We did an extensive literature search trying to find what are the really good references that are out there. And we selected 20 to be on this particular website. Now we have a long list of others, and those of you who have signed up for this webinar will actually contact you after the webinar to see if you'd be interested in receiving that comprehensive reading list. But we have here 20 references where we look at how do we design institutions in fragile states? Because part of what's really critical in getting investment to flow is having that predictable, that stable, if you will, institutional system so that investors have confidence. Investors don't like risk. We have to emphasize that over and over in all of our work, both research and teaching. And so what we're wanting to do in developing these regulatory systems and institutions is diminishing that risk as much as we can so that the investment dollars will flow. What is that governance like? So that the whole system has legitimacy with the population. How do we think about privatization, private participation? That is actually very critical a lot of times in getting the infrastructure deployed. Then how do we think about the quality of the services? What are those kind of key metrics that we might use? How do we understand and deal well with the social environment and environmental issues? The fifth category covers frequently asked questions, and you can see on the slide the questions that we address. You'll find things like, what are the performance targets that we'd have in fragile states? And how do we start thinking about getting data for those, and what are kind of some of the right boundaries that we might use, some of the right targets? Then you'll see that also for states that are countries that are a little bit higher level, a transformation situation. What are the performance targets that we tend to see being used there? And then also things like key performance indicators for fragile states, looking at them a little bit differently and how we measure those. We also have information there on incentives. We want the operators, when they're providing these infrastructure services, to be focused on the primary needs of the country. And so we need to provide incentives so that what they're addressing is also what's important for the peace and for making the country, getting the country in a situation where it can grow. And then this whole issue of public participation. How do we have that legitimacy with the groups? A lot of the times the fragility has occurred because people have been marginalized. And we want a system, as we develop this governance, as we develop the regulatory institutions and systems, to be legitimate with them, to include them, to hear their voices, and perhaps give them voice, give them an opportunity for voice, so that this infrastructure expands and meets the most important needs, both just for the population and for the continuance of the peace. And then, as I'd said before, one of the challenges we hear oftentimes is about dealing with the politics of the situations. And it's not that politics has no legitimacy. It's incredibly valuable for developing the peace and keeping it going. But the political decision-making processes and the business-making processes for infrastructure don't fit very well together. So we want people who are involved in developing these these governance systems to understand very well how do they work in that political environment so that the regulation works, the infrastructure works, and the politics does its job as well. We just want those systems to be compatible. I'm not progressing with my slide. Well, I think actually that's my final slide. I thought I had a wrap-up slide, but evidently I didn't get one in there. So that's what this portal is about. It's covering those different tools. It also has as a sixth item some additional training resources that people can reach out to. But Jemima, that wraps up my part of the presentation.
Thank you, Mark. That's very interesting, and I think, in fact, we've already generated some interest on the chat about these tools. So I'll come back to Xavier de Coster's questions after the discussion. But now let me turn to our discussants. And you mentioned the role of infrastructure regulations in fragile states, and one of them being sort of shielding the decision-making from a lot of political intervention as conflicts are being resolved and peace is being negotiated, usually between many parties. In developed countries, usually we see regulations, the instruments of regulation, and that balancing between the interests of the provider and the consumer is done, let's say, through service standards regulation, competition regulation, and also price setting. I wonder if Yogita can speak to a little bit more about, in fragile countries where you have worked, what have you seen to be motivations for setting up regulatory systems?
Thank you, Jemima, and thank you, Mark, for the very good, very interesting presentation. This is a good question about motivations. It's a challenging question because fragile conflict states, by definition, are experiencing major transition and have really a lot to handle at any given moment. And the question is really, is regulation top on the list of what the country is tackling? Is it actually something that is aspirational, or are governments really extremely motivated to deal with regulation during conflict or immediately following conflict? Because as Mark said, it's not such a simple 0-1 state. You can be in conflict and get out of conflict, but there's always a chance to slip back in. And the question is, in terms of motivations, it's a tough one, because there is a long list of items that any incoming government may be trying to tackle, and whether regulation is on the top of it is a good question. And regulation isn't done in a vacuum. It's part of a policy and institutional environment. And often during conflict and immediately preceding conflict, this policy and institutional environment is developing and starting to develop objectives and consensus around what were possibly very strongly feuding parties or still feuding parties. And so within this institutional and policy framework, what type of regulatory objectives are being set is a good question, because there may be different objectives from different parts of society. So yes, absolutely, the motivations for infrastructure regulation in conflict and post-conflict, immediately post-conflict fragile states is going to be quite different than in developed countries. And what we also see, for example, a country I'm most recently working on, not in, but on, is Yemen. And what we're seeing is that there are two things really, and Mark alluded to this issue of establishing regulatory frameworks when one can. And what you're seeing is that in situations where there had been some thought to regulatory systems prior to conflict, these systems are somewhat more resilient throughout the conflict, and they have a basis to work from. If that thought hadn't been there, then you have a double situation. Not only are you starting somewhat from scratch, but you didn't have more resilience of your infrastructure systems because you didn't really think through the regulatory systems prior to the conflict. But then during conflict, you may have a whole host of new situations may arise which require regulatory attention. For example, you may have new segments of a market. And again, I'm just using the most recent example that comes to my mind in Yemen is the role of the private sector has increased dramatically. It's a very informal, unregulated sector of maybe very mini networks and lots of private takers, but they're clearly coming in and filling a void. This is the water sector, and they're clearly coming in and filling a void. Yet there are issues of price and exclusion, and there are issues of quality. And on top of that, in Yemen, as you know, one of the most water-scarce countries, a lot of our conflicts throughout the world could be more and more centered, for example, around water. And the question is, how does the regulatory system address this? So you may get through conflict and post-conflict a whole new host of issues which the regulatory system would have to tackle, which may not have been there prior to conflict. Just one or two more things. Jemima mentioned how regulation, the types of the types of issues regulation tries to tackle in more developed countries, for example, price, and Marx talked a lot about sustainability. At the same time, in a conflict or immediately post-conflict situation, there are huge investment needs, of course, huge investment needs to build. There are huge operational costs. The systems have a long way to go from pre-conflict, and staff may have exited the country. So you have issues of training and capacity, which may have been weak to start with, but are more exacerbated during and post-conflict. So the needs are great. The financial needs are great, and the capacity needs are great. But is there a will to increase tariffs? Is there a will to do anything with tariffs? So, for example, in Iraq, the capacity may be higher to actually pay for the services. But is there a political will to actually increase tariffs, given there are different groups who the political elites in power may want to please? And can the government, the new and fledgling government, and is there just one government in some of these countries where we work, do they feel comfortable tackling some of the questions we know regulators would need to tackle? So these are some of the questions and issues that I've seen more recently in conflict and post-conflict countries.
Thank you. Thanks, Judita. I thought it was interesting that you mentioned the fact that thinking about regulation systems is in post-conflict, usually people think about reconstruction of the infrastructure rather than investing time and energies towards building institutions right away. And I thought it's sort of a balancing act, and that there are cases to be said about the investments made for institutions that paved the way for better infrastructure service to be delivered later on. And this goes to the point about one of our participants online, Peter Lagarde, is talking about focusing on de-risking. And I thought it was a very interesting point that he mentions this. Many countries after conflict are looking for investors to come in, quickly rebuild, quickly bring in capacity, as you say, to fill in the gap of capacity. Now, I will turn to Dr. Roxana about thinking through how do you balance this sort of role of regulations with let's say investor risk, whether the investor is a donor or a private entity. What has been even in developed countries, how has regulation started to address this balancing issue of bringing in service quickly in an environment where it could be very risky, compensating private operators, but making sure you get best value for money?
Morning. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this webinar. I think that, it is a very good question because it poses the focus on what a trade-off might be. And in my experience, thinking about Peru 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we were a fragile state. And one thing that was very important was to get the advice and to get help from multilateral institutions, particularly the World Bank. Not only because there were some people who deemed that important, but because national private capital was not large enough. And financial markets were thin after a conflict or during the transition to peace in order to be able to finance all the requirements to rebuild infrastructure. So we needed private investors and foreign private investors. And those were not going to come to a country with too weak institutional context. And so the establishment of the regulation, the establishment of the regulatory institutions was part of rebuilding the political context and the strength of the state in the territory. And along with that, you needed to strengthen the capacity of local institutions to welcome, recognize, give validity to all the documents from foreign investors. Sometimes we tend to overlook what can be seen as a detail, but foreign investors, in order to invest in countries like Peru, for instance, in Latin America, they need to go to consular offices in their home countries, okay? And get all the paperwork that recognizes all the people who are the representatives as such, as legal representatives, and then go back to the country. If the whole institutional environment is too weak, that is impossible. And local capital cannot be mobilized. And I think to make the point clearer is that this set of foreign investors, private investors, multilaterals, and some people in the country with the political power to understand that this is key in order to rebuild infrastructure and rebuild the social overhead capital needed in a country in order to resume growth is fundamental to enact that change. The other thing I wanted to, building on the previous comments, is how to build this difficult equilibrium of a leader of a regulatory agency in this context who must have a fluent and clear and smooth relationship with a political leadership, and at the same time be able to fence off political pressure from the different actors in the political scene to influence regulatory decisions. And that is a balancing act. And for some topics, I saw that happen in Peru when I was a staff member of the telecom regulator 20 years ago. And that requires the president of the regulatory agency to choose her battles. She or he cannot fight every battle that is presented to her. It must choose some battles. And so for the staff members, and that is the third point that I wanted to make, the staff members must understand that the leader has more information that we have and is permanently balancing her strength to engage in different battles. The third point regards the staff members. I remember 25 years ago in Peru, it was very important for regulatory institutions to attract the best capital that they could attract. And for that, they could offer good salaries, and they could invite people that just got their master's degree overseas or their PhD degrees overseas in order to build the human capital required to give credibility and to give predictability to the private and foreign investors.
As a follow-up question, Roxana, we have Iyad Ramal who is participating with us, and he's saying, well, some institutions building like you described, it takes time to build these institutions. You're saying it's quite doable, and you should be sort of let's say modest in ambitions, work with what you have, the talents you have, make sure you have a leadership that is engaged and sort of has good judgment about which battles to fight. His question really is about how do you balance the need for immediacy of the reconstruction effort of infrastructure and the sort of the disconnect between the time it takes to build these institutions. So you may not be wanting to wait for institutions to be built before infrastructure service delivery. How have you, what have been the examples of this? And then I'll turn to Mark after this about this concept of a guiding coalition, sort of the less formal types of regulations prior to institution building.
That's a very good question. I understand the urgency because it is not only that your country is in shambles, but a lot of people are having a hard time. And so what you want to avoid by rebuilding as soon as possible is for that situation of terrible living conditions to go on. And so what do? You have to start pretty fast, but slow enough in order to, along with institutional building, bring in the investment needed. And it's a learning process for both. And that is why the human capital at the regulatory agency is key. Because if you are in the process of rebuilding and writing contracts, etc., you cannot wait. You need to have the best capital that you can the best human capital that you can get at the same time that you are trying to attract investors. If that means that you must hire consultants from overseas, you need to do that. And that is part of maybe the loans of the technical cooperation that a fragile country that is trying to rebuild needs at that time in order to get the best into rebuilding as soon as possible.
It also reminds me of the case of Afghanistan, where they were actually able to post-conflict invite investments of upwards of billions of dollars in the ICT sector. And part of that has been about the government itself putting certain investments in place to support private investment. Part of that, but also a large part of that was making the rules clear, as you said earlier, setting out the laws, setting out the licensing procedure, providing some, let's say, periods of, periods where a duopoly arrangement was tolerated, but then being clear that at the end of numbers of years, this will be open to competition. So I think there are some, not many, but some good practices that we can see. So Mark, let me turn to you on this question about nascent regulation systems, and again the urgency, the balance between the urgency of rebuilding and institutions building.
Okay, well, thank you. Yes, and I think Roxana provided some excellent points on that, and so did Yogita. When we think about just trying to take our initial steps in regulation, we're doing that in a context where people are trying to respond very quickly to some very urgent needs of the population. And so it isn't to take resources away from any of that very important work, but to put together starting to put together frameworks that enable resources, that attract new resources in to do that important work of getting services into people's hands. So, for example, Yogita mentioned that, well, maybe regulation isn't really a top priority for a president, prime minister, and his or her kind of direct reports. And that's very likely to be true. They're trying to do other things, provide security, perhaps get some of the infrastructure deployed. And so that brings us to that importance of that guiding coalition. The guiding coalition is a group of people. The conventional wisdom, it needs to be at least 75% of the people who have power to get something done and are on board for the reforms. So it's not a consensus building group. That's a different kind of a thing. But these are people who see the importance of starting to develop those regulatory institutions and structures that will attract investment, attract capital, and make sure that the services are deployed in a way that's consistent with what the country is trying to accomplish. And then, as Roxana was talking about, this group, as it's going through these initial steps, maybe our initial step is just getting the public-private partnerships in place and the right contracts, and then we start while we're doing that, we're thinking about what's going to be the governance for it and what is the next step after that. So this is what the guiding coalition is doing. They're also dealing with that issue of the political interference. And as Roxana indicated, it's a lot of it is about being proactive and not reactive to the political situation. Make sure you've gotten the right relationships built. Making sure that you're in touch with the people who are in political power so that you know how they're thinking and the pressures that they're under. Understanding their situations. And then also being very careful about how you spend your political capital. Roxana talked about it in terms of kind of being strategic in the choices that you make. That is, you only have so much political capital. You have to use it carefully to make sure that the stress that you're putting on the system is something that it can sustain.
Mark, we have a sort of a follow-up question to that. Peter Ledegaard is concerned about political capture, and Ajay also writes about war-torn states being highly susceptible to corruption and political intervention. And so if you're building institutions in a situation like this, how do you know, I guess their question might be, how do you know you're not entrenching interests that are unproductive for, and Mark, maybe you can start, and Yogita, if there are some examples in MENA about how institutions were developed and how they guard against, simply entrenching interests that were there before the conflict.
Yeah, that's really a great question. I'm glad that was raised. One of the things that we talk about is this metaphor of getting on the balcony and looking at the landscape of interests that are around you. So it's stepping back from the action, and in the allies that you have in the guiding coalition, and assessing, okay, what are the interests people have, and what is the action that's occurring beyond your field of vision, so that other people are helping you see that, so that you know that, all right, if we take this step, we are challenging this powerful stakeholder, and we want to make sure that in doing that, we're not disrupting the system too much, as I said earlier, but then also not developing laws, not developing contracts that embeds them in place, so that we actually end up with a monopoly where we should not have, or we're simply building barriers to competition. So it's those kinds of things that, and I just like that metaphor of stepping back and using that balcony perspective to see who the players are, what their interests are, and thinking about that very strategically.
Yogita?
I'd just like to add that I don't think it's all so bleak. There are some good examples. There are limited, but a few examples out there, and my colleague who's been asking questions and who's online, Iyad Ramal, would be able to speak to this much better. But for example, in Palestine, which you could say is a country that's fragile, has been in and out of conflict over quite a few decades, has really taken the initiative to reform its regulatory system. And again, I'm mainly talking about the water sector, what I'm more familiar with what's going on in terms of regulatory reform there. But first, I'd like to step back and completely agree with Mark and Roxana about you need to be strategic and pick incrementally the areas that you can tackle. Because in many of the countries we're working, which are fragile, post-fragile, and low income, the resources are so limited and the challenges are so large. Maybe the best thing is to pick really to cherry pick those areas where you can get some good wins, which is also good for the government, because you do need to legitimize that and bring general peace in order to be able to move to the next steps of regulation and infrastructure building. Having said that, in Palestine, the steps that are being taken are quite ambitious, and really go back to my original point of looking at the legal and institutional framework more deeply, and looking at how the different parties, the different roles that different parties can play, and there are sometimes what some people feel are winners, are losers, and is there some political will to make those decisions. So I won't go into the details of the Palestinian example here, but there are cases out there where we're seeing governments, when you feel there are no other options. Again, you may be so water constrained, and you may have to make such tough choices that you are pushed to the wall and do make these very difficult decisions. So that there are some examples out there where we see in fragile post-conflict and on and off conflict countries that these tough decisions are being made.
Right. And as you mentioned, there are examples out there, and that's precisely the point of this body of knowledge and the platform that we've tried to develop, is to bring in or invite more of these instruments. And it gives me an opportunity to go back to some of the questions of Xavier de Coster around what we can find in this platform. He's particularly interested in whether there is a country-by-country assessment. And in using the self-assessment, he's also interested to understand that you might be in certain subsectors at a different stage of fragility or development that you are in others. And so I will, first I'll ask Mark to speak to some of this, but I know also Roxana has already, as a regulator herself, started to use some of this instrument, and maybe give a little bit of her experience in how this can be useful to others in your as a regulator or practitioner. So Mark, let me turn to you.
Yes, thank you. And to start, let me just add something and echo what Yogita was just talking about. We've seen, for example, in Armenia and Cote d'Ivoire, that once the regulatory institution was starting to be developed, all the people involved there, water in the case of Armenia, telecommunications is my experience in Cote d'Ivoire, it was developing the relationships between those regulatory institutions, the political actors, and the service providers to build that trust so they actually could indeed then take the next steps. To the issue of the self-assessment and the taxonomy, those are two separate pieces of the portal. We did not, and purposely did not, try to do our own assessment of every country. In fact, we stepped back from that very deliberately, because we thought it was more important for people to look at their own situation and try to figure out where they fit in, understanding that there'd be a lot of disagreements in a country and as to what it's really like. We thought those discussions were so important, we didn't want to interject our thoughts into that. But the questioner is exactly right, that a country may be in a crisis mode in some element, but in a kind of rebuilding mode in another one, a transitioning mode in another element. And that's why we have case studies that cut across all of those, so that when you do your self-assessment, then look at the taxonomy and say, I think I fit here. You look at the case studies that we have, and you say, well, actually, maybe I don't. But I do get this lesson here from Afghanistan. I do get this other lesson from Mexico or from Peru. And so that's why the taxonomy and the self-assessment are distinct from each other and structured the way that they are.
Roxana, your experience on some of these tools, or what you as a regulator might want to be or might be looking for?
Before answering your question, I wanted to stress something, to make a point. I think, although we want to fight corruption, moreover in these fragile states in which, like everything, to get anything was an uphill battle, regarding a lot of bribery in order to eat every day or get a medicine. I think there is no corrupt-free regime. I think we must bear with that reality. The point for regulators and for infrastructure building and for maximizing welfare for citizens is how to fight it, how to fight corruption. And at least from the experience of Peru, in which currently former President Fujimori is in jail because of corruption and also of crimes of against humanity, one could say we have the laws and bylaws needed in order to fight corruption, but we actually don't. We are now, as we speak, fight to do, because we are facing in whole Latin America a corruption scheme by a private firm. And how did we learn about that? With facts and proof, etc. Because the US, some of that money passed through the United States financial system. And so after that, we are taking action, and we don't have the legal authority to do what the US is doing right now. And what I want to say is there is no political vacuum, somebody feels it. The same happens with who is the leader of corruption. At least in Peru, there was the leader of corruption in the 1990s, and that was filled in by this private firm based in Brazil. Going to your question, I think the body of knowledge touches, like on every issue, a regulator must know and must be aware of. And if that regulator has come to the PERC course and later on uses the body of knowledge, that may be a key tool to spread the word and spread the knowledge and experience that has been gained through these almost 25 years of regulatory experience in the developing world.
To come to the end of the hour, and it's been excellent that we've had so much engagement from participants online. Ahmed El Sadiq also talking about her interest in forums and platforms. So I think the body of knowledge is one way to start that off, and this group we will reach out to you with links to this, but we encourage people to visit the site. If you're working on a fragile country, we encourage you and your clients to use some of the tools and to bring your knowledge to that platform. Thank you very much to all of our guests, our discussants this morning, but especially the people online. Incidentally, we did a poll also prior to the webinar about what they thought were the most important things that regulation should tackle in fragile contexts. And more than half of the pollster, the poll is still open for 6 days, but as of today, more than half has said to limit political bias, and about a quarter is saying really regulation is about peace building. And I do think that that is true. It is a big part of this rebuilding of the state, is to be able to have laws and systems that work and can be predictable for different stakeholders. Before people go off, if you enjoyed or did not enjoy the webinar, we have a post-webinar survey right now. It takes 2 minutes. Please, before you log off, and thank you very much. A good day to everybody.